If you decide to leave tomorrow morning, I will buy your ticket home myself. Carter stood frozen in the doorway of that small Wyoming hotel room, cracked leather suitcase clutched against her chest like a shield, staring at the tall man who had just said the most dangerous thing anyone had ever said to her. Not dangerous because it was cruel, dangerous because it was kind. Emily Carter had learned a long time ago the hard way, the painful way, the kind of way that leaves marks you can't see in a mirror, that kindness from a man always costs something. If this story moved something inside you, please subscribe to this channel and follow Emily's journey all the way to the end. Comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. Now let's begin. The morning Emily Carter decided to answer a stranger's advertisement in a crumpled newspaper. She was sitting on the cold linoleum floor of her mother's kitchen, except it wasn't her mother's kitchen anymore, and it hadn't been for a long time. It was Roy Briggs's kitchen now. Everything in that house belonged to Roy Briggs now. And Emily had spent the last 4 years learning, with great precision and terrible clarity, exactly what that meant. She was 20 years old. She had shoulder-length blonde hair that she kept braided tight because loose hair gave Roy something to grab. She had blue eyes that she had trained herself to keep flat and unreadable because in Roy's house, emotion was an invitation. That were rough from work, she never asked for, and a mouth that had learned to stay shut even when everything inside her was screaming. Still, she was sitting on that floor because Roy had thrown her breakfast plate against the wall 30 minutes earlier for the crime of setting it on the wrong side of the table. It hadn't hit her that morning. That almost made it worse, the waiting, the silence afterward, that hummed like a power line. She was cleaning egg yolk off the baseboard with a rag when her knuckles brushed against something wedged beneath the old radiator. Folded newspaper, old, yellowed at the edges. She almost tossed it. Didn't know why she opened it. Instead, she would think about that moment for the rest of her life, randomness of it, the smallness of it. One fold of paper, one column of tiny black print tucked between a grain market report and an advertisement for tractor parts. Honest advertisement. Wyoming rancher, 36, widowed, seeks a woman of practical nature for honest partnership, land, livestock, and steady work. I cannot promise wealth or romance. Promise honesty, fairness, and a home where no one raises their voice in anger. If you are a woman looking to build something rather than be owned by something, you do. Write to Walker, Luke Walker, Box 4, Cody, Wyoming. Read it 3 times, then she read it again. She had seen advertisements like this before the girls. At the general store, sometimes passed them around like a joke, laughing at the desperate men and the desperate women who answered them. Order brides, they called them. Women who were either crazy or had run out of every other option. Emily didn't laugh. She cut the advertisement out with the kitchen scissors and folded it into a square the size of her thumbnail and pressed it inside the worn sole of her left boot, beneath the insole where Roy would never find it. She didn't decide right then, not consciously. But some part of her, some quiet, stubborn, half-buried part that Roy Briggs had not yet managed to kill, had already decided she wanted. She waited 3 weeks before she wrote the letter. 3 weeks of watching Roy across the dinner table. 3 weeks of calculating distances, escape routes, costs. 3 weeks of lying awake at night, working out every reason it was a terrible idea, every way it could go wrong, every danger she might be walking into. Because a cruel man you already know is still a known danger. A stranger is something else entirely. But then Roy came home one Tuesday evening with a legal document in his hand and a self-satisfied expression that Emily recognized with immediate, nauseating dread. She had seen that expression before. It was the expression he wore when he had already won something and was only now telling you about it. Sold the South Field today, Heath said, dropping the document on the table in front of her, like it was nothing. Offered a fair price. Signed this morning. Emily looked at the document. Her mother's name was on it. Crossed out. Roy's signature below. That field belonged to my mother, Emily said. Her voice was very quiet. In Roy's house, Quiet was the only register she was permitted. Your mother is dead, Roy said simply, sitting down and reaching for the bread. Everything she left behind is mine now. You might want to remember that. Up at her, then, just briefly, just long enough to make sure she understood, and then he looked back at his plate. He understood. She understood that she had waited long enough. At night, after Roy's snoring filled the house, she sat at the kitchen table under the single low lamp, and she wrote the letter. She didn't write it beautifully. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wrote it the only way she knew how, which was honestly, because dishonesty required energy she didn't have. Mr. Walker, I am 20 years old. I have no money and no property. I am not what anyone would call an easy woman. I have a temper when pushed and opinions I have learned to keep to myself, but still have. I'm not looking for rescue. I am looking for something I can work for and something that is mine. I don't know how to be a wife. I know how to work hard, keep a clean house, and keep my word. If that is worth something to you, I am willing to discuss terms. Respectfully, Emily Carter, Millhaven, Ohio. She sealed it with a drop of candle wax because she had no envelope glue. She mailed it the next morning before she could change her mind, slipping it through the post office slot while Roy's back was turned at the hardware store across the street. So she told herself it would probably come to nothing. She was being foolish. She told herself she was being foolish. She walked back across the street to the hardware store and went back to carrying Roy's bags, and she didn't let herself feel anything at all. Weeks later, a letter arrived addressed to Miss Emily Carter. Roy never checked her mail. He didn't think she received any. It wasn't wrong. She never had before. She took the letter to the outhouse, the one private place in the world Roy Briggs' presence didn't reach, and she opened it with shaking hands. Handwriting was plain and a little cramped, like a man more comfortable with a lasso than a pen. Carter, I received many letters. Most of them told me what I wanted to hear. This was the only one that told me the truth. I respect that more than I can properly explain in a letter. I am 36 years old. My wife passed 4 years ago. I have a cattle ranch outside Cody, Wyoming, about 800 acres, not all of it usable. I have 4 ranch hands who are decent men. The house needs work. To be honest with you about that too. It is not a fine house, a solid one. I do not need a woman to love me. I'm not fool enough to expect that. I need someone willing to try at the work, at the living, at the partnership. I believe you are. That kind of woman based on your letter. One, if you are willing to come, I will send train fare and meet you at the station in Cody. We'll arrange separate accommodation before any ceremony so that you have time to decide with a clear head. You are not obligated to anything until you choose to be. You will write back. Luke Walker. Emily read the letter 4 times. She pressed it to her chest and sat very still in the outhouse for a long moment, listening to the wind move through the boards. She's not a woman who cried easily. Roy had made sure of that. But something shifted in her chest, reading those words. You are not obligated to anything until you choose to be something tight and old and carefully locked away. Go back the same afternoon. I will come. On a Wednesday before dawn. When she took nothing that belonged to Roy Briggs, which meant she took almost nothing at all. 1 change of clothes, and silver thimble. And a small photograph of her mother taken before the sickness came, before Roy came, before everything went sideways. She took the money she had hidden in the heel of her boot. Over 2 years, $12.40, accumulated quarter by quarter and by dime, like a prisoner saving bread. She did not leave a note. Roy Briggs did not deserve a note. She walked 3 miles to the train station in the dark, her suitcase in one hand, her mother's thimble pressed hard in the other. And she stood on that platform in the gray Ohio pre-dawn and felt something she hadn't felt in so long she almost didn't recognize it. Enormous, bone-deep fear, but underneath it barely, just barely something else. Something that might have been hope if she let herself call it that. Didn't let herself call it that yet. She got on the train. The journey took 2.5 days. Sat in the cheapest car, the one that smelled of coal smoke and other people's lunches, and she watched America change outside the window. Blue became Indiana, became Illinois, became Iowa, became Nebraska, land flattening, and then rising again, growing wilder and more weathered the farther west they traveled. Guy getting bigger and bigger until it felt almost aggressive, too much of it, too open, nothing between her and the horizon to hide behind. She had never been west of Columbus. She had never been anywhere, really. She tried to sleep and mostly couldn't. The woman across the aisle was traveling with 3 young children and kept apologizing every time the baby cried. Billy didn't mind. She liked the sound. It was warm and alive and completely unguarded. The way sound should be. The way she had taught herself never to be. On the second night in Nebraska, the older of the woman's children, a girl, maybe 7, with pigtails coming undone, climbed down from her seat and stood in the aisle next to Emily and stared at her with the frank and embarrassed curiosity that only small children possess. "You going?" the girl asked. "Wyoming," Emily said. "Do you have family there?" Emily paused. "I'm going to meet someone." "Is it a husband?" Emily blinked. "Maybe." The little girl considered this seriously. Scared. Emily looked at her for a long moment. She said honestly. The girl nodded, apparently satisfied by the honesty. "Your mama says being scared just means something matters." Tick. Then she climbed back to her seat and curled against her mother's side and fell asleep. Emily sat with that for a long time. Being scared just means something matters. She arrived in Cody, Wyoming on a Thursday afternoon, in the kind of cold that has teeth, the sky flat and gray, and promising snow before nightfall. The station was small. The platform was exposed, for maybe a dozen people standing around. And Emily walked off that train carrying her suitcase and her hammering heart, and she scanned the faces with the trained, dramatic caution of someone who has spent years reading rooms for danger before entering them. She spotted him immediately, not because he was the tallest man there, though he was close to it, because of the hat or the denim or the particular set of his shoulders, though. All of those things together, said Rancher as clearly as a sign. "She's okay." She spotted him because he was the only person on that platform who was not looking at the train. He was looking at the people coming off it, looking carefully, patiently. Without impatience or entitlement, the way a man waits who has had to learn the hard way that things come in their own time. Older than she'd imagined, not dramatically, but the lines around his eyes were deep. His was gray, starting at his temples, and he had the kind of face that had weathered considerable weather, both outside and in. He held his hat in his hands rather than wearing it, which she would later learn he only did in formal situations, and right now apparently meeting his potential wife at a train station qualified as formal. Eyes met. He didn't smile right away. He didn't put on a performance. He just walked toward her with the direct, unhurried stride of a man who doesn't waste motion, and he stopped a respectful distance away and nodded once. "Carter," he said. "Mr. Walker," she said. They stood there for one full second, just looking at each other, two people who had made a gamble with their lives and were now standing face to face with the results of that gamble for the very first time. And then Luke Walker said, "You must be tired. I've arranged a room at the Cody Inn for tonight. My truck's just outside." And just that simply, they began. Drive to the inn took 12 minutes. Luke drove carefully on the icy roads and made no attempt to fill the silence with small talk, which Emily appreciated more than she could explain. She was braced for it. The charming performance, the careful questions designed to assess and flat a particular type of masculine confidence that announces itself loudly and usually turns out to be hiding something. Luke didn't perform. He drove. He glanced at her once briefly, neutrally, and then put his eyes back on the road. "When about halfway there," he said. "The roads get bad this time of year. When I keep chains on the truck from November through March." "Practical," Emily said. "Wyoming requires a certain kind of practical," he said. Then silence again. At the inn, he carried her suitcase as far as the front desk and then stopped. "Miss Hartley, we'll show you to your room," he said. Listen, nodding to the innkeeper, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead. Those words, "and wait still. I'll come by at 9 tomorrow morning." We can have breakfast and talk through whatever you need to talk through before you make any decision. Lee looked at him, and if I decide no, it wasn't quite a question. Met her eyes. Then I drive you back to this station, buy your return ticket, and that's that. The argument. No hard feelings. Just like that. Just like that, he said. Came a long way based on a letter and some faith. What I can do is make sure you have a real choice at the end of it. Lee was quiet for a moment. Most men, she said carefully, would want to make sure that choice came out a particular way. Luke almost smiled then, not quite, but close. Something shifted in the deep lines of his face. Miss Carter, he said, I've got 800 acres and a cattle operation and not enough hours in the day to manage either one properly. What I need is someone who genuinely wants to be there. Who doesn't want to be there is no help to me and no good for herself. Picked up his hat from the desk, where he'd set it. 9 o'clock, he said. Sleep well, and he walked out. Stood at the front desk and watched the door close behind him. Mrs. Hartley, who had clearly been listening to every word, made a soft sound that was almost a laugh. He's been coming in here for supplies, the old woman said, reaching for a room key. Heard him say so many words at once in my life. She looked at Emily over the reading glasses. Be something about you. Emily said nothing. She went upstairs. She set her suitcase on the bed. She sat down beside it. And for the first time in longer than she could properly remember, she sat in a room alone, unhurried, unbothered, and felt the wild and terrifying luxury of not knowing, from one moment to the next, what someone else was going to do. The stillness lasted about 40 seconds. Then she started to cry, in the way she sometimes cried at night in Roy's house, quick, silent, buried in her sleeve so no sound escaped. The way she had forgotten people could cry. The way the little girl on the train cried when she was hungry, and completely, without strategy or containment. You know what she was crying about, exactly. About the field her mother planted that now belonged to a man who had never earned anything. Maybe about 2.5 days on a train toward a stranger's name. Maybe about a 7-year-old girl who said being scared means something matters. About the fact that she had walked off that platform, braced for something cruel. And instead a man had stood there, holding his hat in his hands. For about 10 minutes. Then she washed her face at the basin, changed into her second set of clothes, and sat back down on the bed. She pulled out the 2 letters, his original advertisement and his reply, and she read them again in the lamplight. You are not obligated to anything until you choose to be. He thought about Roy's face when he said, your mother is dead, and everything she left is mine. She thought about the south field her mother had planted by hand. She thought about tomorrow morning, about a man who drove carefully on icy roads and didn't try to fill silence he didn't know how to fill. It would put the letters away. She lay down on the bed, an actual bed, with an actual pillow, in a room where no one was going to come through the door at 3 a.m. with something to prove. She stared at the ceiling and she made her decision. At 9 o'clock the next morning, Luke Walker knocked on the door of room 4 at the Cody Inn, hat in hand. Emily opened the door with her suitcase already packed and sitting next to her feet. Looked at the suitcase. Something moved across his face just briefly, quickly suppressed. Breakfast is ready downstairs, he said, his voice neutral. You know, Emily said, I'm not leaving. He looked at her. The suitcase is packed, she said, because I'm ready to go to the ranch. If you'll still have me. 1 full second of silence. I'll still have you, Luke Walker said. He reached down and picked up her suitcase. They went downstairs for breakfast. The wedding happened that afternoon at the county clerk's office, a civil ceremony. 10 minutes, 2 witnesses pulled from the street because neither of them had anyone to call. Hartley came. She brought a sprig of dried lavender that she pressed into Emily's hand without explanation. They read the vows in a bored monotone. Luke answered when required to. Emily answered when required to. They signed the certificate. The clerk stamped it. It was, objectively, the least romantic event Emily Carter had ever been part of. She had never felt less afraid in her life. Walking out of that office into the cold Wyoming afternoon, Walker, beside her, marriage certificate folded in his breast pocket. Emily looked up at the enormous sky, all that aggressive, overwhelming. Somewhere to hide Wyoming sky, and she breathed it in. Luke asked. Yes, she said. It's about 40 minutes to the ranch, he said. It gets rough the last few miles. I can handle rough roads, she said. At her sideways. I don't doubt it, he said. They got in the truck. Emily held her mother's silver thimble in her closed fist the whole way, pressed tight against her palm. The way she used to hold it at night in Ohio, when the house was dark and dangerous, and the only anchor she had was the small weight of something her mother had once touched. The truck rattled over the rough last miles with them, and ahead of them, the windshield, a gang. Ranch came into view, weathered. Yes, lonely looking. Yes, the house needed work, as he had said, and the barn needed more. It had the particular look of somewhere that had been held together by one man's sheer determination for longer than one man should have to manage alone. But the fence lines were straight. The livestock were healthy. The land was real and solid, and hers, at least, partially, one. As of 10 minutes ago, to a stamped certificate. Home, Luke said simply. Emily Carter looked at it. She said, Ben. And she meant it not because it was perfect, Ben. Not because she knew yet what it would become, because she wasn't terrified, but because for the first time in 4 years, she had chosen it. He had arranged it for her. Nobody had sold it out from under her. They had handed her a legal document with her mother's name crossed out. She had come here with $12.40 and a letter and her own nerve. And this rough, weathered, honest place was what she had arrived at. It was enough. It was more than enough. For now, it was everything. This morning, Emily woke up on Luke Walker's ranch. She lay still for a full minute before she opened her eyes. Old habit. Roy's habit, the one he had trained into her without meaning to, or maybe meaning to exactly. Move until you know what kind of morning it is. When you listen first, you measure the air, you figure out the temperature of the room before you let your face show anything. Wind against the window, distant cattle of a house settling into the cold, and underneath all of its silence. Specific, particular silence of a place where no one was angry. In her eyes. The ceiling was low and slightly water-stained in one corner. The room was spare, a bed, a chest of drawers, a hook on the wall, where someone had once hung something and hadn't for a long time, had shown her to this room the night before. With the manner of a man showing a business associate to a guest room, practical and brief, and had said there was hot water in the mornings if she got up before 6. That breakfast was her own business, and had closed the door quietly behind him. She had lain awake for 2 hours listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house. Now she got up. She dressed quickly, braided her hair without thinking about it, and went to find the kitchen. When Luke was already gone, she could hear him outside, distant voices, the sound of a truck engine, the particular rhythm of a ranch morning already well underway. She stood in the kitchen alone and looked at it the way she always looked at a new space, systematically, practicing, taking inventory. But the left burner ran hot. The counter had a crack running through it from one end to the other, old enough that the edges had smoothed. The window above the sink was drafty. She could feel the cold breathing through the gap in the frame. Shelves held canned goods, coffee, flour, a canister of sugar that was nearly empty, a cast iron skillet, hanging from a hook that had been well used and well seasoned over many years. She made coffee. She made it strong, the way she had always made it for herself in the early mornings at Roy's house, when she had a few minutes alone before the day got dangerous. And drafty window. And she stood at that drafty window and drank it and watched the gray Wyoming morning, and let herself think for the first time in 3 days without fear running alongside every thought. She had married a stranger. She was standing in his kitchen, 20 years old. She finished her coffee, the cup down, rolled up her sleeves, and she went to work. When she started with the kitchen, because the kitchen is always where a house begins or ends. She found cleaning supplies under the sink, not many, but enough. She found a box of tools in the mudroom that someone had organized once and then abandoned. She found the draft in the window frame and plugged it with a strip of cloth torn from an old rag and made a note in her head to ask Luke about proper weather stripping. She scrubbed the counters, she reorganized the shelves so the most used things were at the front and the cans were in order of expiration. She checked the left burner on the stove and adjusted the knob until she understood its particular personality. The floor. And then she swept it again because the first sweep revealed a second layer of dirt that had been living under the first layer for what appeared to be quite some time. She worked for 3 hours without stopping. At 9:30, the back door opened, and Luke came in, stamping mud from his boots. He stopped when he saw the kitchen. He stood very still in the doorway for a moment. "You don't mind?" Emily said, not stopping what she was doing. "I plugged the draft in the window, with a rag for now. I want to do it properly, before the real cold sets in." He looked at the window, looked at the organized shelves, the floor that hadn't been that clean in Emily suspected several years. "Don't mind," he said carefully. "The left burner on the stove runs hot. The gas line checked before winter." "I'll do that." "Almost out of sugar." "I know." A small silence. "Extra coffee," Emily said. "It's still hot." Luke hung his hat on the peg by the door and poured himself a cup and drank it standing at the counter, watching her work with the focused, evaluating attention of a man who respects competence wherever it appears. "You don't have to do all this," he said. "I know I don't have to," Emily said. "You want to?" He looked at her. "I need to be useful," she said plainly, because it was the truth, and she had decided the night before, when lying in that spare room listening to the unfamiliar silence, that she was going to be honest with this man, even when it was uncomfortable. When it was uncomfortable. "I don't know how to sit still in a place and not contribute to it. It makes me uneasy." Luke was quiet for a moment, then he said, "That makes two of us." Coffee, and put his hat back on. "Fence line needs checking on the north pasture," he said. "Be back for lunch if you're making it, but don't feel obligated," Emily said. He nodded, started for the door, stopped with his hand on the frame. "My wife," he said, and then stopped. "Tried again. There are some things in the back bedroom that belong to Sarah. I left them where they were. I don't expect you to deal with them." Turned and looked at him. His back was to her. His shoulders were very still. "I won't touch anything I'm not invited to touch," she said quietly. He nodded once and went out. Emily stood in the clean kitchen for a moment. Then she turned back to her work. She found the garden by accident on the third day. She'd been exploring the outbuildings methodically, because methodical was the only way she knew. And behind the equipment shed, she found a rectangle of ground that had once been a kitchen garden. These beds, carefully constructed from good lumber, now full of old stalks and dead growth and 4 seasons of neglect. One had planted it with intention and real knowledge. Beans, squash, along the back edge where they'd get afternoon sun. There's a rain barrel tilted now of terracotta pots stacked neatly against the shed wall, as though someone had planned to come back to them. Emily thought, this was Sarah's. She stood at the edge of the dead garden for a long time. She thought about Roy selling her mother's field, the way he had set the document on the table, like it was nothing, just a transaction. Just a signature, entire living history of a woman who had planted things and grown things and nurtured things to a line item on a contract. He thought about that for exactly she permitted herself. When she found the shed, found the tools, and started clearing. It took most of the afternoon. The dead stalks came out in armfuls. The soil underneath was cold, but good. She could tell, by the weight and color of it, the way it moved when she turned it, that someone had built this ground up carefully over years. Still there. All that patient work, still alive under 4 years of waiting, pulling the last of the dead root systems when she heard boots behind her. She turned. Luke stood at the edge of the garden. He had clearly just come around the corner and stopped. His face was doing something complicated and controlled, the way his face always did something complicated and controlled, and he was looking at the cleared beds with an expression Emily couldn't fully read. She said immediately, "I should have asked before I touched it." "Sorry." "No," he said. His voice came out rougher than usual. Cleared his throat. No, she would have hated seeing it like that. She's been after me about it for 4 years, if she could. He waited. Luke crouched down and picked up a handful of the turned soil. For a moment, set it back down. She was a better gardener than she was anything else, he said quietly. Just saying something, because she was remarkable at most things she tried. See that, Emily said. From the soil, someone built this ground up slowly. It takes patience. Luke looked up at her. I'm not trying to erase her, Emily said, because she needed him to understand this clearly. I want you to know that. I'm not trying to replace anything. Can't stand to see good work go to waste. Something shifted in Luke Walker's face. Much. Just enough. Plant whatever you want, he said. Up. Brushed the soil from his hands. It should be used. He went back around the shed. Emily turned back to the garden, and she pressed her hands in the cold soil and felt, for the first time in longer than she could track, that strange and frightening sensation of caring about something, wanting something to grow. By the second week, she had a routine. Before 6, for the hot water coffee, strong enough to work for a living. Organized, and breakfast made by the time Luke came in from the morning check. Until lunch, work after lunch. At some point in the afternoon, Luke would appear for coffee, or because he needed something, or though neither of them acknowledged this because the kitchen had become the room where they were most naturally in the same space at the same time. They talked in the practical, information-forward way of two people who had agreed on a working partnership and were figuring out the terms. He told her about the cattle operation, the contracts, the seasonal rhythms, the trouble he'd been having with the north fence since a storm took 3 sections out in September. Tobond. She told him about the window in the mudroom that was worse than the kitchen one, about the shelf in the pantry that was about to come off its bracket, about her plan for the garden come spring. He didn't talk about was everything else. They didn't talk about Sarah. They didn't talk about Ohio. They didn't talk about the $12.40 she had arrived with, or the bruises faded now, but still visible if you knew how to look along her left forearm where Roy had grabbed her the week before she left. Luke saw them. She was certain he saw them. He didn't say anything. She was grateful and, really, obscurely ashamed of her own gratitude. She hadn't done anything wrong, and she knew it, everyone. And yet the shame was there anyway. The particular shame of having been someone's target, which doesn't know how to distinguish itself from guilt. One evening, 2 weeks in, everyone, she was washing the dinner dishes, and Luke was sitting at the table going over his account books, a ritual she had come to recognize. The particular furrow in his brow that meant the numbers weren't doing what he needed them to do. And she said, without quite planning to, you can ask. He looked up. About Ohio, she said, about why I left, when I can see you not asking it, and I'd rather you just ask. Luke set down his pen. He leaned back in his chair and looked at her steadily. Did you tell me what you wanted me to know? He said. Telling you now, she said, ask. A beat. Was it bad? He said. Are you safe now? She turned and looked at him. Once. Then that's enough for me. Emily turned back to the dishes. Once she let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. When he sold my mother's field, she said quietly, the week before I left. She planted that field herself. Before she married him. Before she got sick. He sold it like it was a piece of equipment he didn't need anymore. She paused. It was when I knew I was leaving. Silence from the table. Letters. Luke said, after a moment slowly, the advertisement I ran. I almost didn't run it. Felt foolish. My foreman Hector bet me $5 no one decent would answer, a rancher's classified in a newspaper. He almost smiled. Who won? Still to be determined, Luke said. His voice was dry, but something in it was warm. Ask me in a year. Lee did smile. Then a small one. Be careful. Still, Dandust. Still. She went back to the dishes. Neither of them said anything more. Was different after that. Slightly more room in it. Slightly more air. On the 18th day, Emily went to the back bedroom. Disturb. Anything. Not to take anything. She stood in the doorway and looked. It was a small room. There was a cedar chest against one wall, still closed. Oh, of dresses on hooks, practical dresses, the kind a ranch woman wears, but one of them had embroidery along the collar that was clearly done by hand and clearly done with love. There's a small bookshelf with a dozen novels and a Bible with a broken spine that had been read many times. On top of the cedar chest was a framed photograph, a woman and Luke, younger, when squinting into bright sunlight somewhere with them, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. Lee looked at the photograph for a long time. Sarah Walker had a broad, open face and dark hair, and the look of someone who laughed easily and often, like the kind of woman who built soil up patiently over years. Who planted gardens she planned to come back to? You're going to take your place, Dylan. Emily said softly. Then, to the photograph, we went to the empty room. I don't know what I am here yet, but I'm going to take care of what you built as well as I can. I promise you that. She stepped back out and pulled the door mostly closed. She went back to the kitchen. She started dinner. The town of Cody knew about her before she got there. Towns move fast when they have something worth moving about, and a widowed rancher taking a mail order bride after 4 years of solitude was exactly the kind of thing that a small Wyoming town in winter cannot leave alone. Emily had been on the ranch 18 days when Luke finally needed to go into town for supplies and asked if she wanted to come. She said yes, because she was not a woman who hid from things, even things she was fairly certain were going to be unpleasant. She was right about that. She felt it the moment she walked into the general store. With Luke at her side, the shift in the room, the turned heads, the particular quality of a conversation that stops and restarts itself at a lower volume. Women near the dry goods shelves looked at her with the bright, measuring attention of people who have already formed opinions they are waiting to have confirmed. A man near the back counter said something low to the person beside him, and both of them glanced over. Luke moved through it the way he moved through most things directly, without hurrying, apparently noticing none of it. Lee noticed all of it. She kept her face neutral and her posture straight, and she walked beside Luke and helped carry supplies and answered when she was spoken to, and did not offer anything to anyone who was not speaking to her directly. Hardware counter. At the hardware one, the man behind the register 50s, thick through the chest, particular confidence of someone who has never felt unwelcome in their own town, looked her up and down with zero subtlety. The new wife, he said to Luke, as though Emily were a piece of livestock Luke had acquired. Luke said, without looking up from the bolt selection. Where are you from? The man said to Emily. Yo, she said. Long way to come, he said, with a smile that wasn't quite a smile. Emily agreed pleasantly. Worth it, though. He took up a package of washers and handed it to Luke. You need these, or are these what you already have? Luke said, with just the ghost of something appreciative in his voice. They paid for the supplies and left. On the way out, one of the two women from the dry goods shelves stepped into Emily's path, by blocking it, just pausing in a way that required Emily to pause too. The Walker woman, the woman said. Her name was Doris. Emily would learn later. She was the wife of the biggest landowner in the county after Luke. She had a sharp face and a sweeter manner than the face which Emily would also learn later was a tool she deployed strategically. You were here. I imagine you did, Emily said. You're from originally Ohio. And your family. Stop you there, Emily said, keeping her voice polite and her eyes clear. I'm happy to introduce myself and get to know people here, to be part of this community for a long time. I'd prefer to do it as myself on my own terms, if that's all right with you. Blinked, recalibrated visibly. Of course, she said, with a smile that this time was slightly more genuine than the first one. Luke, who had been loading the truck and had missed all of this, appeared at the store door. He said, ready, Emily said, back to the ranch. In the usual companionable silence, but a mile from the turnoff, Luke said, Henderson has been trying to find out everybody's business in this county for 30 years. You noticed, Emily said. She's not malicious, just relentless. Can handle relentless, Emily said. It's malicious I'm less patient with. He glanced at her sideways. I believe you, he said. The gossip started in earnest about a week later. He heard it first from May, one of the women who worked part-time in the kitchen at the inn and who came out to the ranch once a week with deliveries from the general store cooperative. She was kind and constitutionally incapable of keeping information to herself, and she delivered the way she delivered most news, with apology in her voice and uncomfortable speed, as though saying it fast made it less true. People are saying you married Luke for the land, May said, standing in Emily's kitchen with her delivery basket still in her hands. That you knew about the property before you came, everyone. And I'm sorry, Emily, I'm just telling you what I heard. All right, May, Emily said. She was cutting carrots. She kept cutting carrots. And some are saying you won't last the winter. That Luke was desperate, and that you're not really a proper wife, Emily said. May winced. Something like that. Emily set down the knife. She turned and looked at May, really looked at her. With the steady, undefended directness that she had only recently begun to allow herself, now that she was in a place where it didn't have consequences. May, she said, do you believe that? No, May said immediately and firmly. Then that's what matters to me, Emily said. She picked up the knife again. For telling me. Forewarned is better. You're not going to say anything to Luke or to anyone. You're going to do my work, Emily said, and I'm going to keep doing it. And say what they want. People can say. Eventually what I do is going to be louder than what they say. With the unsatisfied expression of someone hoping for more drama and the relieved expression of someone who had just witnessed more backbone than they expected. At night, at dinner, Emily told Luke herself. She told him because the alternative was him hearing it from someone else, and she had decided early on that she wasn't going to manage what he knew and didn't know. Roy's style, controlling information, controlling the story. She wasn't doing that. People are saying I married you for the land, she said, and that I won't stay past winter. Luke looked at her across the table. What do you want me to do about it? Nothing, she said. I want you to know I know. And I want you to know I'm not going anywhere. I know you're not going anywhere, Luke said simply. You know that. He considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things seriously, without deflection or performance. Because you fixed the mudroom shelf, he said finally. Stared at him. That's your measure of commitment? A shelf? Who's leaving? Luke said. Doesn't spend 3 hours making sure a shelf bracket is properly seated into a load-bearing wall. He looked at him for a long moment. Then for the first time since arriving in Wyoming, she laughed. A real laugh. Unguarded and sudden, in that quiet kitchen the way a bird startles from a bush. He watched her with the expression of a man who has not caused a woman to laugh in a very long time and finds that he has missed it considerably. The shelf needed fixing, Emily said when she'd recovered. Luke agreed. And something in his face was warm in a way that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago. So still, they finished dinner. Outside, the Wyoming winter pressed against the windows. Inside the kitchen, something was building between them, not quickly, not easily, without the particular caution of two people who had both learned this. Through different and painful means, trust was a thing you earned in inches, not given in leaps. It was building, thing, and solid and real, the way good soil builds slowly, the time, the patience. Each is something that keeps choosing to come back, even when it would be easier not to. Storm that brought the motorcycles on a Wednesday in late November. A serious storm, the kind Wyoming does without apology, the kind that takes fence lines and equipment and anything not properly anchored and does what it wants with them. Luke and his ranch hands Hector, the foreman, and the 2 younger men, Pat. Denny had been out since dawn, trying to get ahead of it, and by the time the worst of it moved through, sections of the north fence were down, and the cattle that had been in that pasture were scattered across 2 miles of open land. Emily had spent the storm in the barn, keeping the animals calm, repairing what she could repair with what she had, making a running inventory of damage in her head because Luke would need to know, and she might as well have the information organized when he got back. In the early evening, exhausted and mud-covered, with Hector and the boys behind him, and she had hot food ready because that was the thing she could do, and she had done it. They were all sitting around the kitchen table doing damage assessment when they heard the engines. Multiple engines, deep-throated, unmistakable. Every man at the table went quiet, stood up. Emily watched his face, the readiness in it, the weight of a man whose property just took serious damage already that day and now has to deal with something else. He went to the door. There were 7 of them. Motorcycles, big ones, built for road miles parked in the yard. The men climbing off them were large and weathered in their own way, leather jacketed, them. Some of them old enough to have gray in their beards, them appearing particularly concerned about the looks they were receiving. One in front pulled his helmet off and called out. The north fence on the way in, he said. Blown clean. You got tools and an extra pair or 3 of hands, if you want them. Luke stood in the doorway and looked at the man. Don't know you, he said. Not hostile, just honest. Name's Rudy, the man said. We pass through this way twice a year. We know the road. Saw the storm do that fence from the highway. Figured. Luke was quiet for a moment. Behind him, Emily stepped forward until she was standing at his shoulder. She said. Rudy looked at her. 7. A pause. Not since noon. Then come in, Emily said. First. We'll talk fence line after. She felt Luke glance at her sideways. He met his eyes briefly. He said nothing. He stepped back from the door, and his 6 companions came inside. What happened in the next 4 hours was the kind of thing that small towns build into legend before the participants have even finished living it. Emily fed 7 large men who ate everything on the table and looked genuinely startled by the quality of it, who had been suspicious at the door, ended up in the corner talking quietly with one of the older riders about a motorcycle brand Emily didn't know the name of. And Rudy sat at the table with the fence damage assessment and went over the sections like 2 men who had been in the business of practical problems their whole lives, which they had. Denny, who was 22 and had clearly never been this close to a motorcycle club in his life, was making an effort not to stare that was so obvious it made even Rudy smile. This time meeting the Hells Angels. Kid, Rudy said. Denny admitted. I expected different, Rudy said. People usually do, Rudy said without apparent offense. Set more coffee on the table and watched this and said nothing and noted everything. He went out. After dinner, all of them, Luke's crew and Rudy's crew, ranch people, and 7 road people working together in the cold dark with fence tools and wire. That night, and by 10 o'clock that night, 3 sections of north fence were back in serviceable shape and the scattered cattle were accounted for. When the motorcycles finally disappeared back down the road toward the highway, Luke came inside and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Emily. It's a gamble, he said. I fed them, Emily said. It's not a gamble. That's basic hospitality. Not everyone would see it that way. One has needed hospitality themselves, she said. Luke looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, You're not what I expected, she said. No, he said. I expected practical. It got practical. I didn't expect the rest of it. Lee looked at him steadily. What's the rest of it? He shook his head, not avoiding the question, just not having a word for it yet. He was a man who was careful with words, who didn't spend them until he had the right ones. Some sleep, he said. We've got a long day tomorrow. Good night, Luke, she said. Good night, Emily, he said, down the hall to his room. Stood in the kitchen, her kitchen. She was beginning to think of it in the way you begin to think of a place as yours when you have given enough of yourself to it, and she listened to the house settle around her. Inside, the storm was fully gone. The sky had cleared the way Wyoming skies do after a hard blow. Everything washed raw and cold and brilliantly present. She turned off the kitchen light. She went to her room. She lay down on the bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about a woman named Sarah who had built good soil patiently over years and planted things she planned to come back to. And she thought about seeds, about the way they lie in cold ground all winter, waiting, about the way they don't announce what they're about to do. They just do it. When the time comes, they just do it. Spring came to the Walker Ranch. The way Emily had hoped it would, slowly at first, then all at once, the way things tend to happen when they've been held back long enough. She had planted the garden in late March, working the soil that Sarah had built up over years and that Emily had been quietly feeding through the winter with kitchen scraps and composted straw. Had watched her do it the first time with the skeptical expression of a man who had seen ranch wives come and go. Not that there had been many, really. Just the one really. Memory of Sarah Walker was large enough to fill the space several women might have occupied, and then he had watched her a second time and brought her a bag of boned meal from the equipment shed without being asked. And that was how Hector said what he thought of a person. And Luke had noticed. Luke noticed most things. Emily had come to understand. Then he just processed them slowly and privately. The way deep water moves, you couldn't always see it on the surface, but the current was always there. April, people in town had started to say different things about the Walker bride, universally, not without resistance. Small towns don't reverse their opinions cleanly. They layer new ones on top of the old ones, and both exist simultaneously, and you can hear both in the same conversation if you know how to listen. May had started calling Emily by her first name instead of that woman Luke married. Henderson had stopped her outside the feed store and asked, with approximately 30% less condescension than their first meeting, whether it was true that Emily had organized a literacy evening for the ranch workers' children. The man at the hardware counter had started talking to her directly, instead of through Luke. Small things, the kind of things that don't feel like much individually and feel like everything when you added them up. She was precise about her accounting. And then on a Tuesday morning in late April, a letter arrived with an Ohio postmark. She knew before she opened it. Nodding on the envelope was Roy's, that particular cramped script that had appeared on the backs of chore lists. And once, she had found tacked to her bedroom door that she had folded very small and burned in the kitchen stove. She stood at the mailbox at the end of the long drive and held the envelope for a full 30 seconds. She could hear her own breathing. Then she carried it inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and opened it. Short. Roy had never been a man who elaborated when blunt would do. I know where you are. I know who you married. And Cheyenne tells me that a wife's property interests can be contested under certain conditions. We'll be hearing from him. Don't make this harder than it has to be, Roy. She read it twice. She set it flat on the table. She pressed both palms against the wood and breathed through the cold spike of fear that went through her chest. Old fear, the kind with roots, the kind that knows your name. Then she got up, went to the stove herself, coffee, thinking, gone. She did not fall apart. She was not going to fall apart. When she had fallen apart once, in a hotel room in Cody in November, and that had been allowed, had been necessary. Font had been the pressure releasing after years of accumulation. Different. This was Roy, trying to reach across 4 states with his hand around her throat, and she was not going to give him the satisfaction of feeling it close. Spent 4 years watching Roy operate. She knew how he thought. He moved on the assumption that other people were afraid of conflict, of legal language, of men with authority. He had used that assumption to control her mother, and then to control her, and it had worked because in Roy's house there was no counter information, no outside perspective to verify whether the walls he built around her were real walls or just shadows thrown on the floor. It was not in Roy's house. She was in Wyoming. And for the first time in 4 years, Emily Walker, had room to think. She was still sitting at the kitchen table with the letter in front of her when Luke came in for his mid-morning coffee and stopped when he saw her face. He said, not gently, directly. Luke's version of concern was always direct. She slid the letter across the table to him. He picked it up. His face didn't change much, that deep water thing again. But something in the set of his jaw shifted in a way Emily had learned to read. There's no legal standing, Luke said. I know that, Emily said. It doesn't mean he can't make noise. Noise is manageable. Roy is not just noise, she said carefully. He is the kind of man who believes that if he applies enough pressure in enough places, something gives. He's right about that usually, because he chooses people who are already. She stopped. Luke said. Already used to giving, she said quietly. One. Yon. Luke set the letter down. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, something he rarely did in the middle of a work morning, which told her something about how seriously he was taking this. About the property, he said. Your mother's, she told him. All of it, the field, the house, when the way Roy had worked through the marriage to her mother, which had happened 2 years after her father died, taking slow, steady control of everything that had taken her mother a lifetime to build. The signatures that had appeared on documents Emily had never witnessed being signed. Accounts that had been quietly restructured. The way Roy had always stayed just inside the legal lines, not because he had principles about it, but because he was smart enough to know that the lines were protection for him as much as anyone. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, You said a lawyer in Cheyenne. The letter says, There are lawyers and lawyers, Luke said. He'll have found the cheapest one, willing to write a threatening letter. It's a long way from a real legal challenge. I know. You're not satisfied with knowing that. No, Emily said, because Roy doesn't stop when you tell him he's wrong. He stops when the cost of continuing is higher than what he stands to gain. Luke looked at her. Something moved in his eyes, not pity. She was grateful for that, but something like recognition. The look of someone who understands that a problem stated precisely is already half solved. Find out exactly what he thinks he stands to gain, Luke said. Make sure he understands the cost. Do you have a lawyer? Emily asked. Out of Cody. Good man. I'll call him this afternoon. She paused. This was the part she had been working up to. Something else you should know. My mother's house, Roy has been living in it. It was a condition in her will about the property that I don't think Roy fully understood when he married her. She was careful in her way. She had a brother who was a county clerk. He knew how documents worked. Luke went very still. What kind of condition? The house could not be sold or transferred without the consent of her direct descendants for 20 years from the date of the will, Emily said. 16 when she wrote it. My mother told me about it the week before she died. She said she was sorry she couldn't protect everything, but she wanted me to have something no one could take. Kitchen was completely silent. Roy doesn't know you know this, Luke said slowly. He doesn't know it exists, Emily said. I never told anyone. Luke leaned back in his chair. He looked at her with the careful attention of a man recalculating something important. He said, Yes, that is a very significant piece of information, she said. I've been sitting on it for 4 years because in Roy's house, there was nowhere to use it. She met his eyes. Here I can. Luke picked up the letter again. One more time. Set it down. I'll call Tom Grady, he said. He got up, poured his coffee, and went back outside. Sat at the table for a moment longer. She picked up the letter, folded it precisely in half, and carried it to the stove. She did not burn it. She almost did. Instead, she put it in the drawer where she kept important documents, because a thing you understand is more useful than a thing you've destroyed. And she had spent 4 years learning that lesson the hard way. Grady turned out to be a small, neat man in his early 60s, with the kind of organized mind that made itself visible in how he arranged his desk and how he arranged his questions. He came to the ranch the next afternoon, rather than making them drive to Cody, which told Emily immediately that Luke had described the situation with some urgency. He sat across from Emily at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and asked questions for an hour and a half. When she finished, he looked at his notes for a long time. The will condition is real, he said. I'll need to verify it against the county records in Ohio, but if it was filed correctly and from what you've described, it sounds like it was Roy Briggs has been living in a house he cannot legally sell or transfer. About the field, Emily said. Tom made a specific face. The field is more complicated. If the transfer was recorded before the condition was clarified. He forged her signature, Emily said. My mother was in the hospital when that transfer was recorded. You know the date. She wasn't physically capable of signing anything that week. Tom looked at her. Luke, who had been leaning against the counter listening, Henderson said quietly. She's not speculating. Do you have documentation of her hospitalization? Tom said. You know which hospital and the dates, Emily said. I know the name of the attending nurse because she was kind to me when I came to visit and I remembered her. The signatures won't match because my mother had a very particular way of writing her name and Roy didn't know that. She paused. I've been remembering things for 4 years because I knew that someday I would need them. Grady looked at Emily Carter Walker for a long, quiet moment. He wrote something on his legal pad. Mrs. Walker, he said, I think Mr. has made a significant miscalculation in contacting you. He thinks I'm still afraid of him, Emily said. And are you? She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about most things. Afraid of what he can do, she said. I'm not afraid of him. Tom nodded slowly. That's exactly the right distinction. Passed. Tom Grady sent letters to the Ohio County Records Office and to Roy's Cheyenne lawyer. 1. Luke paid for all of it without discussing it with Emily first. She found the receipt on the counter and brought it to him. And he said simply, fight is my fight, marriage means, and went back to what he was doing with the finality of a man who has said the thing he meant and doesn't need to elaborate. Stood holding the receipt for a moment. Then she put it back on the counter and went to work on dinner. Was not used to that. To someone standing in front of a problem with her instead of being the problem, or watching from a careful distance, or explaining why the problem was really her fault. Was not used to it, and she did not know what to do with it. And so she did what she always did with things she didn't know what to do with. She set it in the back of her mind and kept moving and let it become real gradually. The way her eyes adjusted to a lit room after a long dark. On the kitchen door one evening in early May and came in with his hat in his hands and came with his doing this hands and the thing did when he had something to say that he wasn't sure how to say. Town today, he said, sitting at the table at Emily's invitation. Someone's been asking questions about the ranch, about the cattle contracts. Emily looked at him. What kind of questions? The kind a buyer asks, Hector said carefully, except not a buyer. Someone trying to figure out where the contracts are and when they're up for renewal. Beat of silence. Who was asking? Emily said. Fella from the Henderson operation, Hector said, and then stopped and let that land. Henderson. Doris Henderson's husband, the biggest landowner in the county outside of Luke, set down the dish towel she'd been holding. Does Luke know? She said. You first. Hector said. Figured I don't know what I figured. Figured you'd want to know. That was the moment he understood something about Hector. Not that he trusted her exactly. Hector's trust was a thing that came in the same slow installments that Luke's did, and it was not yet fully paid. But that he had decided she was worth informing, that she was part of the operation's brain now, not just its kitchen. You, Hector, she said. I'll tell Luke. Hector put his hat back on and went out, stood in the kitchen. Roy from Ohio. Henderson from right here. Separate pressures. Two separate, one, and she was suddenly, with the particular clarity of someone who had spent years watching Roy work, and if they were really as separate as they looked. She told Luke over dinner. She told him everything, including the last thought, the connection she couldn't prove but couldn't dismiss. Luke put down his fork. That was significant. Luke did not put down his fork at dinner. Has been trying to expand his operation for 3 years, he said. And he's made me 2 offers on the North Pasture. I turned them both down. When did you turn down the second one? Emily said. Luke said. Before or after Roy's letter? It went very still. After, he said. They looked at each other across the table. A lawyer in Cheyenne? Emily said slowly. Roy would never pay for a lawyer in Cheyenne. He'd find the cheapest path available. A Cheyenne lawyer means someone pointed him toward one who knew the local legal landscape. Henderson has a brother-in-law in Cheyenne, Luke said. His voice was quiet and very controlled. Legal practice. The kitchen was silent. There it is, Emily said. Luke picked up his fork, set it back down, and went to the window. Stood up from the table and went to the window and stood with his back to her for a moment, and Emily could see from the line of his shoulders the particular quality of a man containing something that very much wanted to not be contained. She said, "I'm all right," he said. "I know you are," she said. "I want to know what you're thinking." He turned from the window. His face was controlled, but his eyes were not entirely. "I'm thinking," he said carefully, "that someone has been trying to take this ranch for 3 years through legitimate means. And when that didn't work, we found another way in," Emily said. "Through your history," Luke said. "Something that was done to you. That is." He stopped again. "That is the kind of thing that makes me want to do something I would not be proud of in the morning." Stood up from the table. She walked over to where he was standing. She didn't touch him. They were not there yet. Not in the way that involved touching, without a specific practical reason. But she stood close enough that he could look at her directly. And she held his eyes. "You're not going to do anything you'd be ashamed of," she said. "Roy's way and Henderson's way. Because that's Roy's way and Henderson's way, and we are going to beat them the right way, which is going to be much more satisfying and considerably more permanent." He looked at her for a long moment. "You have something in mind," he said. "Beginning of something," she said. "I need Tom Grady, and I need a few days, and I need you to act as though everything is normal in the meantime. You do that?" "Normal," he repeated, like the word was from a language he was working on. "You do it?" "Yes," he said. "Good." She turned back to the table. "Finish your dinner. The potatoes took me 45 minutes, and I'm not having them go cold." Something moved across Luke's face, something quick and warm that he didn't quite conceal in time. He came back to the table. He finished his dinner. Emily spent the next 3 days at the kitchen table after everyone else was in bed, with every document she could get her hands on spread across the surface. She had always read carefully and retained precisely. It was a skill she had developed in Roy's house, where information was power, and she had been systematically denied both. And so, she had built the habit of absorbing everything available, because you never knew when something would matter. Grady had sent copies of the Ohio County Records response. It confirmed what Emily knew. The property condition in her mother's was legally registered and completely binding. Briggs had been living in a house. He had no legal authority to sell for 4 years, and the field transfer had been recorded 11 days into her mother's final hospitalization. He wrote it all out. Dates, names, document numbers, specific. Simone's cross-reference chain of facts that connected Roy's fraudulent transfer to the Henderson legal practice in Cheyenne, which she traced through a combination of public business registrations and the quiet, methodical work of going through everything Tom had sent and noting every name. Some connection wasn't in the documents, but it was in the timing. Timing, Emily had learned, tells you things that signatures don't always. She was staring at the papers at 11:30 on a Thursday night when the phone rang. She ticked it up before it could wake Luke. "Emily Walker," she said. Pause. Then Roy's voice. And it was immediately, viscerally awful. The way certain sounds can be, is that have been conditioned into your nervous system to mean danger. And she felt her whole body respond before her mind had a chance to weigh in through it. "I know you're awake," Roy said. "Always up late. Thinking you were so clever," she said. Her voice came out steady. "Proud of that. I'm coming to Wyoming," he said. "I'll be there in 2 weeks. I've got a doctor in Cheyenne who will testify you were not in a fit mental state when you entered that marriage. You can settle this quietly, or we can settle it in front of a judge. Choice." Emily closed her eyes for 2 seconds. "Roy," she said, "you don't have a doctor. You have someone who told you he could find one, which is a very different thing." Silence. "You'd have a lawyer who is related by marriage to a man who wants to buy this ranch." Listen, she continued, everyone keeping her voice the same calm, practical, factual. "You have a forged property transfer that was recorded while my mother was in a hospital bed, unable to hold a pen. You have a house you've been living in for 4 years that you have no legal right to sell or transfer, which means every decision you've made about that property since my mother died is potentially criminal." The silence on the other end was different now. "I have documentation for all of this," Emily said. "When my lawyer has copies." The county records office in Ohio has been contacted. When, and Roy, if you come to Wyoming, you will not be settling anything. You will be standing in a state where you have no leverage and a great deal of legal exposure, making claims a judge will throw out in 20 minutes. His voice, when it came, was quiet and very dangerous. She knew that voice. It was the voice that preceded the worst of it in the old days. "I think you're very smart," he said. "I think I spent 4 years paying attention," Emily said. "It's not the same as smart. That's just patience." A long pause. "Come if you want to," she said. "I'll be here." He hung up. She sat very still at the kitchen table, with the papers spread around her, and her heart going at a speed that was frankly embarrassing, given how steady her voice had been. Said a voice from the doorway. She turned. Luke was standing there in the dark hall. He had not been standing there when she picked up the phone. She didn't know how much he had heard. "How long have you been there?" she said. "Long enough," he said. He walked over and pulled out his chair and sat down across from her, at the papers. He looked at her. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. "Was that him?" "Yes." "Is he coming?" she said honestly. "I don't think so." "I don't know." Luke reached across the table and tapped the stack of documents she'd spent 3 nights building. "You did all this," he said. "Not a question. Someone had to. Grady is going to tell me tomorrow that you should be practicing law." Luke said. "He is going to tell you tomorrow that we need to file a counter-complaint with the Ohio County Clerk before Roy can make any moves," Emily said. "Which we do. Can you call him in the morning?" "First thing," Luke said. He didn't move to go back to bed. He sat there across from her in the late-night kitchen. And Emily sat across from him. And neither of them said anything for a minute. And Luke said, "You've been doing this every night," Emily said, "while I was sleeping. You needed to sleep. You had the pasture rotation." His voice was low and had something in it she didn't have a word for. "Didn't have to carry this alone." "I'm not carrying it alone," she said. "I was asleep. You're here now," she said simply, across the papers and the lamplight for a long moment. And something passed between them in that kitchen. Something that had been building in inches for 4 months and went still. Something that neither of them had the right words for yet and didn't need the right words for yet, because it was real regardless of whether they named it. "Some sleep," Luke said quietly. "I'll sit with these for a while." "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to," he said. He recognized her own words from 4 months ago, in a kitchen that smelled of coffee and old drafts and the particular loneliness of a man living in a house too big for one person. She gathered some of the papers and stacked them neatly and left the rest. The page of the county records response, she said, the date circled in pencil. "That's the key one. I'll find it," he said. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the house, Luke still at the table, the occasional turn of a page. The quiet that was no longer the quiet of an empty place, but the quiet of a place with someone in it. She slept better than she had in weeks. Briggs arrived in Cody on a Thursday morning in May, with a man Emily had never seen. He turned out to be the so-called doctor, Roy's particular brand of loud, dent noise that he had always used as a substitute for substance. He drove a rented car. He checked into the Cody Inn, which meant he walked past Mrs. at the front desk, who knew everything and forgot nothing, and by noon had called the ranch to let Emily know Roy was in town. "He's here," Emily told Luke. "I know," Luke said. "Saw the car. He'll go to the county clerk's office," Emily said. "First move. He'll try to establish some kind of official inquiry before he contacts us directly, so that when he shows up here, he can say there's already a process underway." He filed the counter-complaint 2 days ago, Luke said. Him. "I know, but Roy doesn't know that yet." He looked at her. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to let me handle the first conversation," Emily said. "He comes here and he will come here. I need you to let me talk first. And then you can say whatever you need to say," Emily said. "Roy is counting on me being alone in this. He's counting on the man standing beside me being a stranger. And he needs to understand before anything else that he's wrong about both of those things." Quiet for a moment. "Emily," he said, "yes. You know how long it's been since someone stood in this kitchen and outthought everyone in the room." She looked at him. I'm not Sarah did it, Luke said quietly. What I used to call it. She just, she could see the shape of a problem in a way other people couldn't. Gotten what it looked like. He paused. Don't underestimate what you've done here. For yourself, don't underestimate it. Emily Carter Walker stood in her kitchen in Wyoming and felt something shift very deep and very old in the structure of how she understood herself. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He'll be here by this afternoon, she said finally. In the barn, Luke said. Close enough. He went out, turned to the stove and started coffee and thought about Roy driving a rented car toward this ranch, back, thinking he was walking into a room with a frightened girl who had nowhere to run. She thought about the thimble in her pocket, her mother's, always in her pocket now. She pressed her thumb against the cool silver of it. Pretty. Roy Briggs arrived at the Walker Ranch at 2:17 in the afternoon. Knew the exact time because she had been watching the clock in the way she used to watch it in Ohio, not counting down to something good but bracing for impact. Car on the gravel drive. Before she saw it once and she took one breath, her coffee cup down on the counter with the careful precision of someone who refuses to let their hands shake those front to the gun. She opened it before he knocked. That was intentional. Roy's whole strategy depended on him being the one who initiated contact, who set the terms, who arrived with the advantage of surprise. It was not going to give him the door. He looked older than she remembered. Dramatically, 6 months was not a long time, but something in his face had shifted. Some confidence that had always read as solidity, now reading as something thinner, something that needed regular feeding to stay upright. Dressed carefully, the way he always dressed when he wanted to project authority. The man beside him was 50s, soft through the middle, carrying a briefcase in the manner of someone who wanted the briefcase to do more work than he was going to. He looked at Emily standing in her own doorway in Wyoming. And something moved through his eyes, surprise, and quickly suppressed. One recalibration she recognized, the gears of a certain kind of man adjusting his approach on the fly. He said, Roy, she said, you should have called first. We're past the need for social niceties, he said. She said. She stepped back. Both of you. He led them to the kitchen table. She did not offer coffee. Withholding was deliberate hospitality and Roy's calculation was weakness, an attempt to soften him up, and she wasn't interested in softening him. She sat down across from them and folded her hands on the table and looked at Roy with the clear level attention of someone who is no longer afraid of what she sees. Placed his hands flat on the table between them, which is old gesture. She knew it well. He used it when he wanted to signal that he was in control of a conversation. Doesn't have to be complicated, he said. You left without notice, entered a marriage under, I would argue, compromised circumstances. And there are questions about the validity of that arrangement that a court would take seriously, Emily said. He blinked. Excuse me? Court, she repeated. You've been in Wyoming for, she glanced at the clock, 2.5 hours, spoken to a judge. You haven't filed anything. The county clerk's office, which I imagine was your first stop, told you that there is an existing countercomplaint filed against you in Ohio that has already been transmitted to the relevant Wyoming authorities. She paused. Wrong. Roy's face did not change. A lesser man's would have. The complaint is without merit. The man with the briefcase said. He had a Cheyenne accent and the slightly oiled manner of a lawyer who operates at the margins of his own ethics. Attorney, Emily said. Gerald Marsh, he said. Gerald Marsh is a business partnership with the Henderson Property Group of Park County, Wyoming. Emily said. You stay. Which is interesting because the Henderson family has been trying to acquire portions of this ranch for the past 3 years. She looked at Roy. No, you knew people in Wyoming. Roy, that's a long way to reach. His eyes went flat. She had seen that before, too. The moment when the performance dropped and the thing underneath showed itself was the most honest he ever looked, which was a grim irony. You've been busy, he said quietly. I've been paying attention, she said. That's all I've ever done. The back door opened. Luke came in. He did not come in loudly. He did not come in with any kind of performance. The kitchen, in his usual direct way, and stood at the counter and crossed his arms and looked at the two men at his kitchen table with the particular expression of a man who has listened to enough of a conversation from a nearby room to have strong feelings about it and chosen this exact moment to make those feelings spatially clear. He looked at Luke, looked at Emily, recalibrated again. Bunker, Mr. Walker, Roy said, and Emily could hear him trying to find a new angle. His wife was under considerable emotional distress when she answered when she left Ohio, concerned for her well-being. That's why I'm here, Luke said. It was not a question. She left in circumstances that suggest she wasn't thinking clearly, Luke said, with $12.40 and a letter she wrote herself and a 6-hour train connection she planned alone. It doesn't strike me as someone who wasn't thinking clearly. It strikes me as someone thinking more clearly than anyone gave her credit for. He pivoted. The property question has been referred to the Ohio State Attorney's Office, Emily said. Roy stared at her. As of this morning, she continued. Grady, our attorney, filed the documentation with the state AG's office this morning. Forged transfer of my mother's field, the property condition violation, and the timeline of my mother's hospitalization versus the recording date of the signature. She looked at him steadily. She signed her name 11 days after she lost the use of her right hand. Marsh's briefcase came off the table and onto his lap. It was an involuntary movement. Emily noted it. That's a significant allegation, Marsh said. It's not an allegation, Emily said. It's documented fact with hospital records, nursing staff corroboration, and a handwriting analysis requested from the Ohio Forensic Document Unit 2 weeks ago. She paused. I've had a lot of evenings to work with. Roy was quiet for a long moment, looking at Emily the way he used to look at things that weren't behaving the way they were supposed to, with a cold, focused attention that had always preceded the worst of what he was capable of. You think you've thought of everything, he said softly. I think I've thought of most things, Emily said. When I left room for what I missed, it was always your problem, he said. Now his voice had dropped into something personal and ugly. It's in boy, something that had nothing to do with Marsh or legal strategy. Your mother was the same way. Too smart for her own good, in her own head. He leaned forward slightly. You know what that got her. The kitchen went absolutely silent. Luke uncrossed his arms. Emily put her hand flat on the table, stood down, held Roy's eyes. Get out of my house, she said. Her voice was quiet and completely without tremor. Roy didn't move. Get out, she said again. Same volume, same steadiness, time. And this time Luke had moved from the counter to the end of the table and was standing behind Roy's chair, not touching anything, not threatening anything, present in the way that a wall is present, immovable, and not interested in discussion. Old Marsh stood up. He had the look of a man reassessing his fee structure. Roy stood up slowly. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Emily for a long moment with an expression she had seen before, the expression of a man who is retreating from this field, but telling himself it is a strategic repositioning. This isn't finished, he said. Yes, it is, Emily said. She walked to the front door and opened it. Roy and Gerald Marsh walked out. She closed the door behind them. She stood with her hand on the door and listened to the car start and the gravel crunch and the sound of the engine getting smaller and then disappearing entirely into the Wyoming afternoon. Then she turned around. Luke was still in the kitchen, looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not the warm but controlled thing she had come to know. Not the practical appreciation he showed for competence, but something rawer that had gotten past his careful management of himself. You all right? He said. Yes, she said. And then, because honesty was the contract she had made with herself in this house, he said something about my mother. I want him to pay for what he did to her, she said. Not just legally. I want it to have cost him something real. Hello, Luke said. Tom called while you were at the door. Lady's office is moving faster than expected. Apparently there are other complaints against Briggs. properties. Your mother wasn't the first. Emily closed her eyes. Other women, she said. Other families, Luke said, was the clearest documentation. Yours is going to be the one that opens the rest. She stood in the front hallway of the Walker Ranch and felt the particular weight of that, the way one woman's careful attention, one mother's quiet legal forethought, one daughter's 4 years of remembering, just become the door through which all the rest of it would come. Your mother knew, Emily said quietly. She knew something like this was possible. Why, she wrote the condition into the will. She was trying to protect me even after she was gone. She did protect you, Luke said. Emily pressed the silver thimble in her pocket, so hard the edge left a mark in her thumb. She said she did. The news moved through Cody the way all news moves through small towns, faster than anyone can explain and slower than anyone can stop. By the following week, people knew that the Walker Ranch had been the site of a confrontation involving Roy Briggs from Ohio and a Cheyenne lawyer with Henderson family connections. And by the week after that, people knew considerably more than that. May had talked to Doris Henderson, and Doris Henderson had done what she always did, which was extract every available detail and redistribute them with additions. What people did not expect was what happened to Bill Henderson. It came out on a Tuesday, quietly at first, through a notice in the county records that Tom Great flagged and sent to Luke and Emily. Property Group had been under audit by the state business licensing office for the past 14 months. Marsh's involvement in both the Henderson operation and Roy Briggs's legal threat had flagged something that the auditors had been building a case around for considerably longer than anyone knew. Doing this before us, Emily said, reading Tom's letter at the breakfast table. It just accelerated it. Your documentation gave them the connection they needed, Tom said over the phone when Luke called him. On business records, you traced. That was the link they'd been missing. You built a chain they could actually use. Luke put the phone down and looked at Emily across the table. You know what this means, he said. Henderson loses the business license, Emily said, which means the purchase offers on this ranch were never legitimate. Luke finished, using operating capital from fraudulent accounts to fund the acquisition offers, which means the pressure on the cattle contracts. Coordinated, Luke said, deliberately. He was trying to force the ranch into financial stress to lower the sale price. They sat with that for a moment. It's bigger than I thought, Emily said. Roy didn't just connect with Henderson by accident, she said slowly. Someone introduced them. Someone who knew about the property condition in my mother's will and saw a way to use it. Luke's expression sharpened. Who knew about the condition? His brother, Emily said. The county clerk. He filed the will. She stopped, and he died 3 years ago, which means his files. Went to the county records office, Luke said. Anyone with the right legal access could have found them, Emily said. Gerald Marsh, who does business law in Cheyenne and has access to interstate records requests. She set Tom's letter down on the table. Marsh found the condition, she said. Understood what it meant. Found Roy. Offered him a way to contest it if Roy would share the settlement. Brought Henderson in as the buyer. Luke was quiet for a long moment, he said. A dead woman's property, and a girl they thought was too scared to fight back. Entirely wrong, Emily said. 6 months ago, I probably wouldn't have been able to do this. What changed? She looked at him across the table. Stopped being alone, she said simply. Luke looked back at her. A man who was careful with his face. He was doing a poor job of being careful with his face. To call Tom again, he said. Yes, she said. Him about Marsh and the records access. That's the piece that makes the whole thing criminal rather than just civil. Luke picked up the phone. Emily picked up her coffee. Sighed. She could hear Hector and the boys at the barn. The normal sounds of the ranch going about its business. A particular kind of ordinary that she had come to understand was not actually ordinary at all. It was earned, was maintained. The result of daily choices made by people who showed up and did the work. She thought about her mother's field. She thought about the soil in Sarah's garden, built up patiently over years. She thought about roots, The week before the court date, Rudy came back with 6 riders, this time just 3, and they came in the afternoon and parked their bikes in the yard with the particular careful courtesy of people who understand they are guests on working land. And Rudy knocked on the front door with his helmet under his arm and asked for Emily specifically. She came to the door. "Heard you've got a court date coming," Rudy said. He looked at him. "News travels. We go through Cody twice a year," he said. "He talks." "May always talks," Emily agreed. "We can't help with lawyers," Rudy said. "We've got 2 men who were working for Henderson's operation last year and saw things they're willing to say in front of a judge. We don't trust the legal system much, generally. We trust you." Emily stared at him. "They don't know me. You know what kind of person feeds 7 strangers in a storm without asking for credentials first," Rudy said. "And sometimes that's enough." She stood in the doorway for a long moment. "Come in," she said. She made coffee. They sat at the kitchen table, Rudy and his 2 companions, Luke and Hector, who had come in from the yard when he heard the bikes and taken up his habitual position in the corner with his arms crossed, and the 2 men who had worked Henderson's operation laid out in plain and practical terms what they had witnessed. Orders falsified to claim equipment for Henderson land that had actually been used on other acquisitions. Payments made to county officials for favorable zoning decisions. Conversation overheard in the Henderson equipment barn about a Ohio problem that could be leveraged if the right legal contact was made. Tom Grady, when Emily called him that evening, said, "Tell me these men are willing to testify formally," Emily said, "but they need to be treated with respect by the court. Reasons not to trust the system. I'll make sure of it," Tom said. "Emily, this is the testimony that changes the criminal classification of Henderson's conduct. This is significant." "I know," she said. "How did you get it?" He thought about November, about a storm and 7 strangers and hot coffee, and the instinct that people, regardless of how they look or where they come from, generally respond to being treated like they matter. "We fed some people once," she said. Tom was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've been practicing law for 30 years, and I want you to know that this is one of the most unusual cases I have ever." "I'll see you on Monday, Tom," Lee said, and hung up. She turned around. Luke was leaning against the doorframe, looking at her with the expression he sometimes wore, that she still didn't have a word for the one that had gotten more frequent over the past few months, one that appeared when she did something that caught him off guard. Not because it was surprising in itself, but because it kept confirming something he was still in the process of accepting. "One," she said. "Nothing," he said. "Luke." He was quiet for a moment, thinking about what Tom said about the case. "And I was thinking," he said slowly, "that I placed an advertisement in a newspaper because I needed a practical partner." He paused. He was not thinking clearly about what practical actually means at the scale operator. He looked at him. "Is that a complaint?" "No," he said, moved in his face, warm and unguarded and more open than she had ever seen it. "It's the opposite of a complaint." She turned back to the counter before her face could do something embarrassing. "Some sleep," she said. "Monday's a long day," he said. "Yes," a pause, long enough that she turned back around. He said, "For fighting for this place." She held his eyes. "It's my place too," she said. He nodded. "Simple. That complete?" "Yes," he said, "it is." The court's date was a Monday in June, and the courtroom in Cody was small and wood-paneled and smelled of old paper, and it was full. Lee had not expected it to be full. She had expected Tom Grady and Luke and Roy and Marsh and the Henderson lawyers and the relevant officials. She had expected a procedural day, documents, testimony, the careful machinery of legal resolution. She had not expected May sitting in the second row. Had not expected Doris Henderson, who had apparently decided that whatever her husband had done was not going to define her presence in this community, and had come and sat on the side of the room that left no ambiguity about whose side she was on. Not expected Hector and Denny and Pat, cleaned up and serious. Expected, in the back 2 rows, 7 men in leather jackets who had ridden 4 hours for a Monday morning hearing. And Luke walked in together. She felt the room shift the same way it had shifted in the general store. 7 months ago, the same turned heads, the same quality of attention. Different now. The temperature of it was different. Roy was already there, the plaintiff. At the plaintiff's table, with Marsh beside him, and a woman, Emily, didn't recognize, who turned out to be a second attorney hired in the last 2 weeks assigned. Tom had told her, Roy was starting to understand he was losing and was throwing resources at it. He looked at Emily when she walked in. His expression was controlled and cold. He met his eyes and then looked away, not because she was afraid of him, but because she was done letting his face be the thing her attention organized itself around. Where's Dawn? She was done with that. She had been done with that since the night she sat in a Wyoming kitchen at midnight and built a case out of dates and signatures and a mother's quiet forethought. She sat down beside Luke and Tom. Tom leaned over and said quietly, "The AG's office sent a representative." One sitting at the back left. "What does that mean?" Luke said. "It means this is no longer just a civil proceeding," Tom said. "And whatever happens today, the criminal piece is moving whether these parties like it or not." Lee looked down at her hands in her lap. Her mother's thimble was in her left palm. Closed her fingers around it. The judge came in. Over the next 4 hours was methodical and precise, and for Emily, emotionally enormous. In a way, she kept very tightly controlled because the courtroom was full of people, and she was not going to cry in front of Roy Briggs. Not once. The property condition was confirmed. Tom, the county records. The opposing attorney argued that the condition was improperly filed and therefore invalid. Asked for the original document. Which Tom had obtained through the Ohio AG's office, showed proper filing, witness signatures, and a date 11 years before Roy Briggs had entered the picture. The forged transfer was presented. The hospitalization records were presented. The analysis was presented. Roy's attorney objected to the handwriting analysis on technical grounds. The judge overruled and looked at the documents for a long time without expression. Gerald Marsh's Henderson connection was entered into the record. 2 former Henderson employees testified. One of them was a large man in his 40s named Cal, who had worked for Henderson for 6 years and had the particular quietly furious dignity of someone who watched corruption operate from close range and had been waiting for a way to say so. He testified for 40 minutes and did not look away from the judge once. Attorneys cross-examined Cal. He answered every question with the flat, factual precision of someone who had nothing to hide and had prepared for exactly this. Lead attorney tried twice to introduce the mental instability claim. The judge dismissed it both times, once with a question about documentation and once with a look that conveyed, without words, that the court's patience for this particular line was exhausted. Then Tom put Emily on the stand. She sat in the witness chair and looked at the courtroom and saw rows of faces, Sally's worried expression, and Doris Henderson's set jaw and Hector's crossed arms, and Luke in the third row with his hat in his hands. He'd held it on a train platform in Cody on a cold November afternoon, looking at the people coming toward him with patient, unhurried attention. Tom asked his questions. She answered them clearly, and specifically dealing with dates and document numbers and the careful cross-reference precision of 4 months of midnight work at a kitchen table. Attorney stood up for cross-examination. "Mrs. Walker," he said, with the particular smoothness of a man who thinks he has something. "Isn't it true that you left Ohio without informing anyone of this marriage within days of arriving in Wyoming? You have a financial interest in the outcome of this proceeding?" "Yes to the first 2, Emily said. "As for the third, my interest is in having my mother's estate correctly managed according to her documented wishes. It's the legal and moral right of any heir. I assume you're not arguing otherwise." A small sound from the gallery. Not quite a laugh. "Something your mother," the attorney continued, "was by your own account not in good health in her final years." "My mother." And Emily said quietly, "A property condition into her will, because she was a careful, decided woman who understood that the people she loved might need protection she couldn't provide in person, and the fact that she thought to do it and did it correctly And that I remembered she told me about it. That is the reason we are all here today. She paused. I think she deserves the credit for that. The courtroom was very quiet. The attorney sat down. The judge ruled at 4:17 in the afternoon. The property condition was valid and binding. The field transfer was referred to the Ohio AG's office for criminal investigation as a fraudulent document. Briggs's claim of any interest in Emily Walker's inheritance or marital property was dismissed in its entirety. Marsh's involvement with both the Henderson operation and Roy's legal strategy was referred to the state bar. Henderson's business license suspension was upheld pending the ongoing audit. Roy sat at the plaintiff's table and looked at the surface of it with the expression of a man who had believed, until approximately this moment, that the world was still organized the way he had always found it. Sat at the defense table and breathed. Luke put his hand over hers. She looked at it, his hand over hers, large and work row, and completely steady. She turned her hand over and held it. When they walked out of that courtroom into the June afternoon, the full gallery coming out behind them, May was crying in the way she did everything openly and without embarrassment. Shook Luke's hand, and then, with the slightly awkward formality of a man not naturally given to the gesture, turned to Emily and shook hers too. He was waiting on the courthouse steps. Well, he said. It's done, Emily said. Rudy nodded. He looked at her for a moment with the direct attention of someone who means what they say. For what it's worth, he said, that was worth the ride. He smiled, a real one, unguarded, uncontained. Thank you, she said, the men who testified, for coming. We were in the area, Rudy said, with the specific Wyoming deadpan of someone who had ridden 4 hours specifically for this. Behind her, then she heard Roy Briggs's voice one last time, speaking to his attorney, a fragment of defiance or denial that she didn't catch the words of and didn't try to. And she made a conscious choice not to turn around. She was done turning around to look at what was behind her. She looked at Luke, standing 2 steps down on the courthouse steps, hat in hand. Watching her with that expression she still didn't have a word for, but was getting closer to understanding. He said, yes, she said. She walked down the steps to stand beside him. Noon was warm. The sky was large. Somewhere across town, Constance, in the direction of the highway, motorcycles started up in succession. The sound rolling through the clear June air, like something that had done its work and was moving on. He wants to get dinner, Luke said. Celebrate. Yes, Emily said. I already did, Luke said. We'd meet him at the inn. At 6, Mrs. Will be pleased, Emily said. Mrs. Hartley already knows, Luke said. May called her. Emily shook her head. Of course she did. They walked to Luke's truck in the courthouse parking lot. The same truck from November, the one that had driven her 40 minutes from the Cody Inn to a weathered ranch on a rough road. The one with chains on the tires from November through March, because Wyoming requires a certain kind of practical. Luke opened the passenger door. Emily got in. He walked around to the driver's side and got in and started the engine and pulled out of the lot, and the town of Cody moved past the windows. He looked at it, the hardware counter, and the general store and the inn where she had sat on a bed in room 4 and cried with her whole body, and then washed her face and made a decision, and she felt something she recognized from a train and platform in Ohio, that terrifying sensation that had lived underneath the fear. She hadn't let herself call hope yet. She let herself call it now. The truck turned toward home. Summer settled over the Walker Ranch, the way good things tend to settle quietly, without announcement, in the spaces between one ordinary day and the next. Came in strong. Emily had known it would. Built the soil carefully through the winter and planted with intention in the spring. And now the beds that Sarah Walker had built with patient hands were full. Again, tomatoes heavy on the vine, beans climbing their poles along the back edge, catching the afternoon sun exactly the way they had been designed to catch it. Had stopped walking past the garden note without looking at it. He stood at the fence some mornings with his coffee and looked at it the way a man looks at something he has decided is proof of a thing he suspected but wasn't sure of. She said nothing, with Hector noticing was enough. Cattle contracts that Henderson had tried to sabotage came back stronger than before. Word moved through the county about what Henderson had been doing, and in a small county, word moved completely and fast. Two buyers who had previously worked with the Henderson operation came to Luke directly, negotiated both contracts himself, with Emily sitting at the table, because she had been sitting at that table for every significant decision since May, and they both understood by now that was where she belonged. And one of the buyers, a man named Garrett, who ran a feedlot operation in Sheridan, looked at Emily across the table at the end of the negotiation and said, "You the one who put together the documentation that caught Marsh?" Emily said. Garrett looked at Luke. "You want to keep her. You figure out how to make that obvious," he said. He with the blunt humor of a man who meant it as a compliment and didn't have a more delicate way to deliver it. He looked at Emily. "Working on it," he said. Emily looked at her paperwork. He felt her face do something she couldn't entirely control. Briggs's criminal proceedings moved through the Ohio courts over the summer, with the particular momentum of a case that has good documentation and an AG's office that has been waiting for exactly this kind of opening. The other families came forward once the case was public. Them had properties that overlapped with Roy's record in ways that Tom Grady described as a pattern so clear, it's almost insulting. His attorney, not Marsh, who was dealing with his own bar complaint, but a new one, entered a guilty plea on 2 counts in August to avoid trial on 5. Tom called Emily with the news on a Tuesday morning. She was in the garden when her phone rang. She listened to Tom's voice. She said, "Thank you, Tom." She hung up. She stood among Sarah's tomatoes and her own bean poles, and the herbs that smelled of something green and living and completely indifferent to Roy Briggs. She pressed her mother's thimble against her palm and let herself feel the full weight of it, not triumph exactly, but something quieter and more solid, that felt like an account that had finally been settled correctly. He went inside and told Luke. He put down his coffee. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. He nodded slowly. "Your mother's field. Still under review," Emily said. "Tom says the original transfer being criminal doesn't automatically restore it, but there's a strong civil case for recovery. It'll take another year." "We have time," Luke said. She said, "We do." It was May who told Emily about the women. Came out to the ranch on a September afternoon with her delivery basket and a look on her face that meant she had something to say that she'd been working up to for a while. "2 women in town," May said, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee. "One came in from Nebraska last month, left a bad situation. One is local, been local for years, but things have gotten she doesn't have anywhere to go." May stopped. At Emily. "I told them about you. I hope that's all right." Quiet for a moment. "What did you tell them?" One. "I told them you would know what to do," May said simply. "Because you did." Emily looked at her hands on the table. "About a train platform in Ohio at dawn. $40. A letter written in a kitchen at night while a man slept. Particular math of a person, with no resources and no choices, trying to find a door that opens. Send them to me," Emily said. May's expression did something complicated and relieved and a little proud. He told them, "I thought you'd say that," she said. "This woman, the one from Nebraska, came on a Thursday. Was Clara. Her name was Clara, and she was 34 and had the precise, careful watchfulness of someone who had been living in a dangerous environment long enough that caution had become indistinguishable from breathing. She sat at Emily's kitchen table with her coffee and didn't say much for the first hour. Didn't push. She understood the architecture of that silence, the way you don't speak until you've taken the measure of a room, until you know whether the air in it is safe. She just made food and kept the coffee hot and let Clara sit until she was ready. Clara said, "I don't know what I'm supposed to do next." "You know how to do," Emily said. Clara blinked. Apparently not the question she expected. "I can sew. It's in an office once. Before I know basic bookkeeping." "Keeping," Emily said. She thought about Luke's account books, about hours he spent at the table with that familiar furrow between his brows. You might know someone who needs that. Would you be willing to stay in Cody for a while? If there was work. Looked at her. You don't know me. No, Emily said. But I know what it looks like to need a door that opens. And I know what it meant when someone gave me one. She held Clara's eyes. This is not charity. This is a transaction. You work, you're paid. You build something. That's all. Clara looked at her coffee cup for a long moment. She said, quietly, okay. The second woman, the local one, whose name was June and who had 3 children and a situation that the town had been carefully not talking about for years, came on a Saturday. When she'd need a place to go, as much as she needed someone to sit across from her and say, without flinching, that what was happening to her was not acceptable and that she had options. He sat across from her and said exactly that. Then she said, do you know Tom Grady? Everybody knows Tom Grady. June said, good. I'm going to call him on Monday and he's going to tell you about what your legal options look like. He owes me a favor. June stared at her. Don't do things for free. This one does, Emily said, because I asked. After June left, Luke came in from the yard and looked at Emily at the kitchen table. Building something, he said. I'm doing what makes sense, she said. The same thing, he said. With you, it's always the same thing. Emily looked up at him. He was standing in the doorway, his own doorway, the one he'd stood in for 4 solitary years, and he looked at her the way he'd been looking at her with increasing frequency since June. With that expression, she now had a word for. She'd found the word slowly, the way she found most things, through careful attention and patience. It was home. He looked at her the way a person looks at home. Luke, she said. Yeah, sit down. He sat down. You want to start something formal, she said. Not just helping women when May sends them to me. Within was structure. Evening literacy sessions for the ranch kids, Denny mentioned. His nephew can't read above a 2nd grade level, and nobody's done anything about it. Skills for women who need to rebuild. Bookkeeping, legal literacy, how to read a property document. She paused. We want to use the front room. The big one. Luke looked at her. Hasn't been used for much since Sarah. Emily said. I think it should be used. Silence. I think she'd agree with me, Emily said quietly. Looked at the table. Something moved through his face, grief and release. The particular combination that Emily had come to recognize as the expression of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and is learning mentally. Zon's to set it down. He said she would. Then I can use the room? House too, he said. You know that. She did know that. She had known it for a while, but hearing him say, it still landed somewhere important. Thank you, she said. He reached across the table and picked up his coffee and drank it and looked at her with that word behind his eyes. Going to want to know what he signed up for, he said. He signed up the day he brought me bone meal without being asked, Emily said. He just doesn't know it yet. Luke almost smiled. Don't tell him that. Never, she said. His literacy evening was on a Wednesday in October. 8 months after Emily had arrived on a train from Ohio with $12.40. Children came. 3 women who sat in the back corner and said he was only there to make sure the chairs were set up correctly, which fooled no one. By the end of the evening, he was helping a 9-year-old sound out words with the careful attention he brought to everything he did. He was there. Clara, she had been working for Luke for 6 weeks and keeping his accounts with a precision that had made him say, once, his books hadn't been in this kind of order since Sarah, which was the highest compliment he knew how to give. June came with her youngest on her hip and sat in the front row and didn't say much, but she came, and she came the week after, and the week after that. She came, and somehow ended up organizing the refreshments, which surprised no one. Henderson came on the 3rd week and sat in the back and brought a pie, and afterward told Emily that whatever she thought of her husband's actions, and she had a great deal to say about her husband's actions, none of it complimentary, this was the right kind of thing and she wanted to help fund it. Emily looked at Doris for a long moment. You're serious, Emily said. A great deal of money and a great deal of embarrassment about how some of it was made. Doris said bluntly, you do something useful with both. All right, Emily said. Monday, we'll talk. Doris nodded, just looked at Emily with the frank one. Assessing a tension she'd had at their first meeting months ago, outside the feed store. The judgment she was taking now was different. You know, Doris said, when Luke first ran that advertisement, when I said to Bill that no decent woman would answer it. A lot of people said that, Emily said. I was wrong, Doris said simply. He looked at her. You were working with the information you had, she said. We all do. Doris looked at her for one more moment. Then she picked up her coat and left. Emily stood in the front room, the room that had been closed for 4 years, that Sarah had used for gatherings, that smelled now of children and coffee, and the particular warm disorder of a space being used for the purpose it was built for. And she looked at the chairs and the books on the makeshift shelves, and Hector still in the corner talking to the 9-year-old about a word she was stuck on. The house was making noise. 4 years of silence. The walk rant was making real living. That noise. Ensconced a December evening. The first snow of the season coming down steady outside the windows, and his crew arrived with a truck bed full of supplies, canned food, then warm clothing, boxes of books, and unloaded everything into the front room with the efficient goodwill of people who have decided that a place is worth returning to. He made enough food for everyone. She always did. At the long table, Rudy and his 6, and Hector, and Denny and Pat, and May, and 3 of the women, Benjamin, who had been coming to the Wednesday evenings, and 2 of the children, who had stayed late because their parents were still talking. It was loud and crowded and slightly chaotic and completely warmly alive. Point. Emily looked down the table, at all of it, at May, laughing at something Rudy had said. Cutting bread with the same serious face he used for fence repair, Denny. At talking to one of the writers about something mechanical, Clara. Writing. Something in a small notebook she kept in her pocket now, as though ideas were things worth recording. And she felt something she had no language for in Ohio, something she had not had enough experience with to recognize when it first started happening. Recognized it now. It was belonging. Not the belonging of someone who had been allowed to stay. The belonging of someone who had built the room herself, her own hands, with not her own choices, and invited people into it, because she wanted them there. And she felt Luke's eyes on her. She looked up. He was watching her from the other end of the table with that expression, the word she'd found for it. And he didn't look away when she caught him, which was new. He used to look away. He didn't anymore. She held his eyes across the noise and the warmth and the full, loud, wonderful disorder of the table they had built together. Something. He said something. She couldn't hear it over the noise. She shook her head. Couldn't hear. He said it louder, and the people nearest to him heard it and went quiet. And then the quiet traveled down the table the way quiet does when something important is being said, until the whole room was listening without quite meaning to. He said, Luke said that I'm glad you answered the letter. The table was completely quiet. Emily looked at him. Oh, glad you wrote? One worth answering, she said. May. Probably. It was always May made a sound that was approximately a sob converted at the last moment into a laugh. Said something quiet to the man beside him. Hector looked at the ceiling with the studied neutrality of a man who was not going to cry at a dinner table. Stood up. He walked down the length of the table, past May and Rudy and Hector and all the others, and he reached into his jacket pocket and set a small wooden box on the table in front of Emily. She looked at it. Open it, he said quietly. She opened it. Inside, folded and worn at the creases from being read more times than she'd known, were 2 pieces of paper. Original advertisement from the newspaper, cut carefully, as she had cut it with the same scissors probably, and kept the letter. Her honest, unbeautiful, plain-spoken letter that she had sealed with candle wax and mailed before she could change her mind. She looked up at him. I kept them, he said, since November. I don't know exactly when I understood why. He paused, in the way he always paused when he was making sure the words were the right ones. I thought I ran that advertisement because I needed a partner for this ranch. His voice was low and steady and completely unguarded in a way she had never heard it before. Didn't understand until a lot later that what I actually needed was to believe again that something good could still happen. Lowe's still had that in it. He looked at her, what I was actually looking for. I just didn't know how to say it in a newspaper advertisement. Sat at the table that was hers, one in the house that was hers, one in the life she had built out of $12.40 and a kernel of stubborn, unkillable hope, one. And she looked at Luke Walker, this careful, patient waterman who had offered her a choice before he offered her anything else. And she felt her mother's stencil in her pocket and the solid weight of the wooden box in her hands and the warmth of 15 people at a table behind her. And she understood with the full and complete certainty of someone who has done the work to earn it, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Stood up. She took his face in both her hands, rough hands, garden hands, the hands of a woman who builds things, and she held it the way you hold something you are not letting go of. She said, "Yeah," he said, "I'm not going anywhere." He said, "I know you know," she said, "I'm saying it anyway." He put his hands over hers, held them against his face for a moment. Then he pulled her in and held her the way the ranch held the fence lines against everything. Absolutely, without question. He was definitely crying now. No conversion attempt this time. Side, the snow came down over the Walker ranch, over the straight fence lines, and the healthy livestock and the garden sleeping under winter, in soil that had been built up patiently, lovingly, by two different women who had never met, but who both understood, in their different ways, that the things worth having are the things you tend carefully and refuse to abandon even when the season is hard. Inside, the table was full. The house was loud. And Emily Carter Walker, who had left Ohio with a numb but nerve and a dead woman's thimble, and the radical, defying decision to believe that one open door was worth the risk of walking through it, held on to her husband in a room full of the family she had built with her own hands. And she was at last completely and permanently home, or rescued by others. Emily rescued herself, and in doing so, brought an entire world back to life with her. That is the only kind of rescue that lasts.